Hello, welcome to the world of stories. Here, each video is a journey full of emotion, mystery, and unforgettable adventures. Thank you for clicking to watch and embarking with us on another captivating narrative. If you like stories that hold your attention and touch the heart, don't forget to like.
The sprawling Donovan estate stood like a crown jewel in the heart of Beverly Hills, its grandeur amplified by the soft glow of thousands of lights strung across the perfectly manicured gardens. This was no ordinary evening. The charity gala hosted by Charles and Victoria Donovan had become a staple in high society, an invitation coveted by celebrities, moguls, and politicians alike. Inside the mansion, preparations moved at a fevered pace. The staff worked tirelessly, their polished shoes whispering against the marble floors as they moved through the labyrinth of rooms. The air smelled faintly of lilies and fresh linen, a testament to the Donovans' insistence on perfection. Victoria Donovan, poised and flawless in an emerald green gown that hugged her statuesque frame, surveyed the preparations with a critical eye. Her diamond necklace caught the light as she moved, drawing gasps from those who dared to glance her way. She was the kind of woman who inspired awe and intimidation in equal measure. "Is that champagne at the wrong temperature?" she barked at one of the waitstaff, her voice slicing through the hum of activity. Without waiting for a response, she spun on her heel and gestured at the towering floral arrangements lining the ballroom. "These orchids look droopy. Replace them. I won't have mediocrity ruining my event." Her commands echoed through the space, sending the staff into a frenzy. This was Victoria's kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron will, her icy demeanor capable of silencing even the boldest soul. Claire Harper arrived through the service entrance at the back of the estate, her head bowed slightly, her shoulders squared. She wasn't here to mingle with the wealthy or admire the mansion's opulence. Tonight, like so many other nights, she was here to work. The evening was unseasonably warm, and Claire wiped a bead of sweat from her temple as she adjusted the straps of her cleaning apron. The agency had sent her to cover for a last-minute cancellation, promising extra pay for her trouble. She needed the money. She always needed the money. The interior of the Donovan mansion struck her as a study in excess. Crystal chandeliers, marble staircases, and ornate furniture filled the space. The wealth on display was almost suffocating, and yet, Claire felt no envy. She had learned long ago that luxury often came at a cost. Her assignment was simple: stay out of sight, clean discreetly, and avoid making waves. It was a mantra Claire had followed for years, and she intended to stick to it. She moved quickly, her steps quiet as she made her way to the kitchen, where a supervisor handed her a list of tasks. As the first guests began to arrive, the energy in the mansion shifted. Claire could hear the hum of expensive cars pulling into the driveway, the voices of the affluent mingling in the entryway, and the occasional burst of laughter. She focused on her work, polishing silver trays and wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. But even as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. From her position in the corner of the ballroom, she glanced up briefly and caught sight of Victoria Donovan. The woman's piercing blue eyes swept across the room, scanning every detail, every person. For a moment, Claire thought Victoria's gaze landed on her, but it was so brief she couldn't be sure. Claire lowered her eyes quickly, returning to her task. The night wore on, and the mansion filled with the elite. Claire moved like a shadow, darting between rooms, making herself invisible. She polished glasses, cleaned spills, and ensured the mansion remained flawless as the guests laughed and danced under the golden glow of the chandeliers. Every now and then, she caught snippets of conversation that felt like whispers from another world. "Did you see the auction items? A diamond necklace worth $500,000. Charles Donovan really knows how to bring in the right crowd. This event will raise millions. I heard Victoria personally approved every detail. She's a perfectionist." Claire kept her head down, pretending not to hear. The lives of these people were a universe away from her own, and she had no interest in bridging that gap. As she stepped into the kitchen for a brief moment of reprieve, the head chef stopped her. "Take this tray to the East Wing," he said, shoving a silver platter into her hands. Claire hesitated. The East Wing was where the more intimate gatherings usually took place, a space reserved for the Donovans and their closest friends. She didn't belong there. But the chef was already barking orders at someone else, leaving her no room to argue. With careful steps, Claire made her way through the mansion, balancing the tray. The closer she got to the east wing, the quieter it became. The hum of the crowd faded, replaced by the muffled notes of a piano. She rounded a corner and nearly collided with a man in a black tuxedo. "Careful," he said, his tone sharp but not unkind. "I'm sorry," Claire replied, stepping back. The man studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. She recognized him from earlier in the evening, Charles Donovan. Unlike his wife, Charles carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His presence was less commanding but no less powerful. "Are you lost?" he asked. "No, sir. I was asked to bring this tray to the east wing." Charles nodded slowly. "All right. Just be quick about it. Victoria doesn't like disruptions." With that, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Claire's heart raced as she moved down the hallway. The east wing was smaller but no less opulent. It was quieter, more intimate, and yet the tension in the air was palpable. Claire delivered the tray to the designated table and turned to leave, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of Victoria in conversation with a group of women. Victoria's laughter was loud, bordering on theatrical, but her eyes betrayed her. She was scanning the room, looking for something, or someone. Claire slipped out of the wing as quickly as she could, her chest tight. By the time she returned to the main area of the mansion, the energy had shifted again. The night was reaching its peak, and the guests were more animated, their voices louder, their movements looser. But Claire couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been building since she arrived. Something about the Donovans, about this entire event, felt off. As she moved to the edges of the ballroom to wipe down a table, she realized she was being watched again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Victoria stood across the room, her gaze fixed squarely on Claire. Claire's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She lowered her head and continued working, pretending not to notice. But deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before Victoria made her move. The Donovan mansion was alive with revelry. Guests swirled through the expansive rooms, laughter and music mingling in the air. Outside, the fountains sparkled under the moonlight, their gentle cascades a soothing contrast to the growing intensity inside. Yet beneath the glamour, there was an undercurrent of unease, a quiet tension that pulsed through the air, unnoticed by most but impossible to ignore for those who paid attention. Claire Harper was one of those who noticed. As the night deepened, her steps became more deliberate, her senses sharper. She wasn't a stranger to the way places like this could turn, from polished civility to something colder, harsher. It was in the tone of a passing comment, the dismissive glance of a guest, the tightening of Victoria Donovan's jaw as she surveyed her kingdom. Claire worked with quiet precision, moving from room to room. Her cleaning tasks provided a flimsy shield, a reason to remain unnoticed, but she could feel eyes on her more often than she liked. The weight of scrutiny was palpable, though she didn't dare look up to confirm it. In the ballroom, Victoria Donovan was holding court. The crowd around her laughed at every well-timed quip, their admiration as polished as their jewelry. Victoria thrived in these moments, her words sharp but charming, her presence commanding. Yet, her focus wasn't entirely on her adoring audience. Her gaze flitted across the room, always returning to the edges, the fringes where the staff moved. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Claire lingered. Victoria didn't like loose threads. Everything about tonight had been planned meticulously, every detail approved by her discerning eye. And yet Claire, the young woman Victoria had noticed cleaning earlier, felt like an anomaly. There was something about her presence that Victoria couldn't quite place, and that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Charles Donovan, meanwhile, moved through the crowd with an ease that belied his wealth. He had mastered the art of blending in among his peers, his charm subtle and genuine. But even he wasn't immune to the tension that seemed to ripple just beneath the surface. As he stepped away from a conversation about investments, his eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on his wife. Victoria was in her element, radiant and imperious, but there was a sharpness to her that he recognized all too well. He followed her gaze, curious about what had caught her attention, and found himself watching Claire as she cleaned along the edges of the room. Charles tilted his head, studying her for a moment. She didn't seem out of place, not in the traditional sense. She was quiet, professional, her movements efficient. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a sense of purpose that set her apart from the other staff. "Everything all right?" Charles turned to find one of his oldest friends, Andrew, standing beside him. "Of course," Charles replied with a small smile. Andrew followed his gaze and chuckled. "Staff's doing a great job, aren't they? The place looks spotless." Charles nodded but said nothing, his thoughts lingering on Claire. As the night wore on, Claire found herself in the library, polishing the edges of a massive mahogany desk. The room was quieter than the rest of the house, the only sound the faint strains of music filtering in from the ballroom. She took a moment to breathe, the weight of the evening pressing against her shoulders. The library was a sanctuary of sorts, its shelves lined with books that looked untouched, their spines gleaming under the soft light. Claire's fingers grazed the edge of one, an old legal tome that felt out of place among the glossy coffee table books and gilded volumes. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to sit in this room as its owner, rather than as someone tasked with cleaning it. Her reverie was interrupted by the creak of the door. She straightened quickly, her hands falling to her sides as Victoria Donovan stepped into the room. Victoria's presence filled the space instantly, her gown trailing behind her like liquid emerald. She didn't speak at first, her eyes sweeping over the room before landing on Claire. "Why are you in here?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp but quiet. "I was told to clean the library, ma'am," Claire replied, keeping her tone neutral. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Do you often linger in places you don't belong?" Claire felt her pulse quicken but forced herself to remain calm. "No, ma'am. I was just finishing up." "See that you do," Victoria said, her gaze lingering on Claire for a moment longer before she turned and left the room. Claire exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing as the door clicked shut behind Victoria. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere had grown livelier, the energy heightened by the flow of champagne and the hum of conversation. Claire returned to her tasks, her steps careful as she navigated the crowd. She felt the shift before she saw it, an almost imperceptible change in the air. The laughter seemed louder, the movements of the guests more exaggerated. And then she saw Victoria, her expression sharper than before, her gaze locked on something, or someone in the room. Claire followed her line of sight and realized, with a sinking feeling, that Victoria was looking at her. Claire lowered her head, focusing on her work, but the sense of unease grew stronger. She could feel the weight of Victoria's attention, the silent promise of confrontation that hung in the air like a storm cloud. And for the first time that evening, Claire wondered if she'd made a mistake in coming here. The mansion had grown louder, the cacophony of laughter, clinking glasses, and piano music blending into a crescendo that echoed off the gilded walls. The air was thick with the heady sense of floral arrangements and expensive perfume, an invisible reminder of the wealth that surrounded every corner. Yet for Claire, the sounds and smells faded into the background. Her unease had grown sharper with every passing minute. Though she tried to keep her focus on the tasks at hand, polishing banisters, cleaning glasses, clearing forgotten plates, her instincts screamed that she was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. She could feel the burn of Victoria Donovan's gaze from across the room, a sharp and relentless presence that lingered no matter where Claire moved. Victoria had stopped speaking with her guests as frequently, her sharp tongue replaced by an almost predatory stillness. Claire, however, had no plans to make herself a target. She stayed near the kitchen as much as possible, stepping into the ballroom only when absolutely necessary. She kept her head down, avoided eye contact, and worked quickly. But no matter how careful she was, Victoria's attention seemed to follow her like a shadow. The crescendo reached its peak when the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the evening's main event. A hush fell over the crowd as Charles Donovan stepped onto a small stage at the head of the ballroom, microphone in hand. His tuxedo fit him perfectly, his presence commanding without effort. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his voice steady and warm, "thank you for joining us tonight for what has become one of our most cherished traditions. Your generosity has already made a significant impact, and we are thrilled to share how tonight's contributions will change lives." Applause filled the room, and Claire took the opportunity to slip into the shadows near the doorway. She leaned against the wall, watching as Charles continued his speech. There was something calming about the way he spoke, his words carefully chosen, his delivery effortless. But even as the crowd hung on his every word, Claire couldn't help but glance at Victoria. Standing near the stage, Victoria appeared the picture of elegance, her emerald gown catching the light as she smiled at her husband. But her smile was brittle, her eyes cold. She didn't look at Charles as he spoke. Instead, her gaze darted toward the crowd, and toward Claire. The speech ended with thunderous applause, and the atmosphere shifted once again. Guests returned to their conversations, the energy now infused with the excitement of upcoming auctions and donations. The ballroom grew even more crowded as servers moved through the throng with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Claire took the opportunity to retrieve a mop from her cart and slip away to the quieter hallways. A spill near the East Wing entrance needed cleaning, and she welcomed the chance to escape the crowd, even if only for a moment. She moved quickly, her steps light on the polished marble floors. The East Wing was quieter than the rest of the mansion, its ornate doors closed to the public for the evening. Claire knelt to clean the spill, her focus on her work. "You seem to like wandering off." The voice startled her, and she turned to see Victoria standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Claire straightened immediately, gripping the handle of the mop. "I was asked to clean this area, ma'am." Victoria's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you were. Always so obedient, aren't you?" Claire felt her pulse quicken but forced herself to remain calm. She didn't respond, waiting for Victoria to continue. "I've noticed you," Victoria said, stepping closer. Her tone was low but laced with venom. "You're very good at staying invisible, aren't you? But here's the thing about people like you, no matter how much you try to blend in, you always stand out. Always in the wrong way." Claire's grip on the mop tightened, her knuckles white. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Victoria tilted her head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. "That depends. Are you a problem?" The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Claire didn't flinch, meeting Victoria's gaze for the first time. She didn't know what had drawn the woman's attention to her, but it was clear that whatever game Victoria was playing, she intended to win. Victoria's smile returned, colder than before. "Be careful, Claire. I'd hate for you to end up regretting something." And with that, Victoria turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Claire stood there for a moment, her breath shallow as she processed the encounter. She had dealt with difficult people before, but Victoria was different. Her words weren't born of simple arrogance or entitlement, they carried an undercurrent of something darker. The spill forgotten, Claire returned to the main kitchen, her mind racing. She needed to keep her head down, stay out of Victoria's way. This was just another job. All she had to do was make it through the night. But deep down, she knew that things were far from over. Back in the ballroom, Victoria rejoined her guests, her demeanor bright and charming as if nothing had happened. But as she sipped her champagne and laughed at someone's joke, her mind lingered on Claire. Something about the young woman unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Perhaps it was her composure, her refusal to be cowed, or the way she seemed to carry herself with an air of quiet confidence that felt out of place among the staff. Victoria didn't like loose ends, and Claire Harper was beginning to feel like one. Meanwhile, across the room, Charles watched his wife with a thoughtful expression. He had seen her leave the ballroom earlier, her irritation barely concealed. And now, as she laughed and charmed her way through the crowd, he couldn't help but wonder what, or who, had set her off. The night continued, but beneath the surface, the tension simmered, waiting for the moment when it would boil over. The night had reached its zenith. The ballroom pulsed with energy, the laughter louder, the music more vibrant, and the guests more animated with each passing moment. The charity auction was in full swing, with dazzling items being paraded before the eager eyes of the elite. Yet, in the midst of the splendor, an undercurrent of unease wove its way through the crowd like a thread unraveling a tapestry. For Claire Harper, the evening was becoming harder to navigate. She had done her best to stay out of Victoria Donovan's path, sticking to the edges of the room, avoiding unnecessary attention. But the intensity of Victoria's earlier confrontation lingered, a dark cloud casting a shadow over her every move. Claire wasn't naive. She had met people like Victoria before, women who thrived on power, who relished in asserting dominance over others. But this was different. Victoria's fixation on her felt personal, as if she were searching for something deeper, something hidden. And that scared Claire more than she cared to admit. The tension finally broke during the auction's intermission. Claire had been clearing empty glasses from a table near the edge of the ballroom when she felt it, a prickle at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Victoria's voice rang out, cutting through the hum of conversation like a blade. "You there," she said, her tone sharp and commanding. The room quieted slightly as heads turned toward Claire, who froze in place. She straightened, the tray of glasses balanced carefully in her hands, and met Victoria's icy gaze.
"Yes, ma'am,"
Claire said, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. Victoria's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes.
"You've been very diligent tonight. Perhaps too diligent. Tell me, do you find this event amusing? Or is it just my imagination?"
Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question.
"I don't understand, ma'am."
"Oh, I think you do," Victoria said, stepping closer. Her emerald gown shimmered under the chandelier's light, but there was nothing warm about her presence.
"You've been lurking around all evening, haven't you? Watching, listening.
Tell me, is there something you find particularly fascinating about this event?" The guests nearest to the exchange had gone silent, their attention now fully on the unfolding drama. Claire could feel their stares, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, but she refused to let her composure falter.
"I'm here to do my job, ma'am," Claire replied, her tone measured. Victoria raised an eyebrow, her smile tightening. "Your job, is it? Tell me, what does your job involve, exactly? Eavesdropping? Lurking in rooms where you don't belong? Or is there something else you're after?"
The words hung in the air like poison, and the quiet murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Claire's grip on the tray tightened, her mind racing as she tried to decide how to respond.
Before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Victoria."
All eyes turned to Charles Donovan, who had stepped away from his conversation at the other end of the room. His tone was calm but firm, his expression unreadable. Victoria turned to him, her smile slipping for the briefest of moments before she recovered.
"Charles, darling, I was simply addressing a concern. Surely you understand the importance of ensuring that everything is in order."
Charles's gaze shifted to Claire, and there was something in his eyes, an apology perhaps, or recognition.
"I'm sure the staff are doing exactly what they've been asked to do," he said evenly. "Let's not create unnecessary drama."
The room buzzed with whispered speculation as the tension between husband and wife played out before their audience. Victoria's expression hardened, but she relented with a gracious nod.
"Of course, darling. You're absolutely right." She turned back to Claire, her smile returning. "Carry on then."
Claire nodded, her heart pounding, and quickly retreated to the safety of the kitchen. Inside the kitchen, Claire leaned against the counter, her hands trembling as she set the tray down. The weight of the encounter crashed over her, leaving her breathless. She had expected Victoria's ire, but not in such a public, humiliating way. The staff around her exchanged glances, but said nothing. They all understood the unspoken rule of their world: stay silent, stay invisible, and hope the storm passes. But Claire wasn't sure she could endure this storm much longer. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere was still electric, though now tinged with unease. Charles watched as Victoria resumed her role as hostess, her laughter loud and forced, her charm strained. He knew her too well to be fooled by the facade. When Victoria finally broke away from the crowd, he followed her into a quieter corridor. "What was that about?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Victoria turned to him, her eyes flashing.
"What do you mean?"
"You know exactly what I mean. That spectacle with the cleaning staff. What were you trying to accomplish?"
Victoria scoffed, crossing her arms. "I don't appreciate being questioned, Charles. Especially not in my own home."
"This isn't about questioning you," he said. "It's about treating people with decency."
"She was out of line," Victoria said sharply.
"There's something off about her, Charles.
She doesn't belong here."
"She's a cleaner," he said, his tone clipped. "She's here to do her job, nothing more." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she said nothing.
Charles sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"Let it go, Victoria," he said. "You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be." With that, he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the corridor. In the kitchen, Claire stared at her reflection in the stainless steel surface of the refrigerator door. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and frustration. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. But deep down, a spark of resolve began to grow. If Victoria Donovan wanted a confrontation, Claire wouldn't run.
Not anymore.
The clamor of the gala had grown muted, the atmosphere less jubilant and more strained as the evening wore on. The tension between Victoria and Charles had not gone unnoticed by the guests, their whispered exchanges creating ripples of speculation that swirled through the grand Donovan ballroom. Yet, despite the undercurrent of unease, Victoria held court with her usual icy charm, her laughter carrying through the air like brittle glass. In the kitchen, Claire Harper had found a momentary reprieve from the storm. The weight of Victoria's public humiliation still clung to her, but a flicker of defiance had taken root in its place. She hadn't asked for any of this: the confrontation, the attention, the venom in Victoria's voice. All she had wanted was to finish her work and leave unnoticed. Now, though, she realized that escaping the Donovans' world without another clash was a near impossibility. Claire was summoned back to the ballroom by the head butler, who handed her a tray of champagne flutes with little more than a gruff nod. The party had reached its final hours, the auction complete, the attendees more relaxed and emboldened by the endless flow of champagne. As she entered the room, she felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on her. Whether they were truly looking at her or not, the paranoia burned. She moved carefully, weaving through clusters of well-dressed guests, offering the tray with a practiced smile and silent efficiency. "Excuse me," a familiar voice said as she passed near the main bar. Claire froze, her pulse quickening. She turned to see Charles Donovan standing there, his tuxedo jacket draped over one shoulder, his tie slightly loosened. He looked like a man caught between weariness and determination. "Sir," she said, her voice cautious. Charles glanced around, ensuring no one was paying too much attention, then leaned in slightly. "Are you all right?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, momentarily unsure of how to respond. "Yes, sir." "Thank you," she said finally, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. Charles's expression softened. "I know tonight hasn't been easy for you." He paused, searching for the right words. "Victoria can be intense." Claire hesitated, her mind racing. Was this a genuine moment of kindness, or something else entirely? Before she could answer, the sound of Victoria's voice cut through the air, sharp and unmistakable. "Charles." They both turned to see Victoria approaching, her expression a mask of tightly controlled fury. Her emerald gown shimmered under the lights, but her eyes were cold and unyielding. "Darling," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "I wasn't aware you decided to make friends with the help." Charles straightened, his demeanor shifting to one of calm authority. "I was simply making sure our staff is treated with the respect they deserve," he replied evenly. Victoria's smile tightened. "How noble of you." She turned her gaze to Claire, her eyes narrowing. "But I believe Miss Harper has other duties to attend to, don't you?" Claire swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yes, ma'am," she said, retreating before the moment could escalate further. She returned to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she set the tray down on the counter. Her composure was beginning to crack, the weight of the evening pressing down on her like a vice. One of the other staff members, an older woman named Evelyn, approached her. "You all right, dear?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft. Claire nodded, though her eyes betrayed her turmoil. "I just need to get through the rest of the night," she murmured. Evelyn patted her arm. "You're stronger than you think. Don't let her get to you." Claire managed a small smile, grateful for the woman's kindness. But even as she tried to steady herself, she couldn't shake the sense that the night was far from over. The final confrontation came just as the last guests were beginning to filter out. Claire had been tasked with clearing the tables near the ballroom's grand piano, her movements slow and deliberate as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. Victoria's voice startled her. "Miss Harper." Claire turned to see Victoria standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of disdain and calculation. "Ma'am," Claire said cautiously. Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "I've been watching you tonight," she began, her tone laced with venom. "You've done an admirable job of staying invisible, but let's not pretend you're not paying attention. I see the way you look at this house, at these people. You think you're better than this, don't you?" Claire's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't think that, ma'am. I'm just here to work." Victoria laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Don't lie to me. People like you always think you're owed something. You think you can waltz into a place like this and what? Rise above your station." The words stung, but Claire refused to let her composure falter. "With respect, ma'am, I don't think that at all," she said, her voice steady. "I came here to do my job, nothing more." Victoria took another step closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "People like you don't belong here. Remember that." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, the weight of Victoria's words pressing down on Claire like a storm about to break. But before either woman could speak again, Charles's voice interrupted. "Victoria," he said sharply, stepping into the room. His tone was calm but carried an edge that silenced his wife immediately. "Charles, this doesn't concern you," Victoria said, her composure slipping. "It does when you treat someone like this," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Claire stood frozen, caught between the two Donovans as their unspoken battle played out before her. For the first time that evening, Victoria looked genuinely unsettled. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. "Let it go," Charles said firmly. "The night is over." Victoria's expression hardened, but she said nothing. With a sharp turn, she stormed out of the room, her gown trailing behind her. Charles turned to Claire, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" Claire nodded, though her heart was racing. "Yes, sir. Thank you." He hesitated, then gave a small nod before following his wife. Claire stood there for a moment, the tension in her chest slowly easing. The storm had passed, for now. But as she looked around the emptying ballroom, she knew one thing for certain: this night would not be forgotten. The grand Donovan mansion was nearly silent now. The once crowded ballroom, alive with laughter and music just hours ago, had been reduced to a hollow echo of its earlier glory. Staff moved quietly through the space, clearing glasses and straightening chairs, their movements choreographed in the muted aftermath of the gala. Claire Hopper stood near the edge of the ballroom, her hands aching from hours of work. The tension of the night still clung to her like a second skin. Despite the late hour, she wasn't allowed to leave until every surface sparkled and every table was cleared. Yet, even as she worked, her mind churned with the weight of Victoria Donovan's venomous words. "People like you don't belong here." The phrase repeated in her head like a drumbeat, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Claire had endured plenty of humiliation in her line of work, but this felt different. It wasn't just the words, it was the look in Victoria's eyes, the deliberate cruelty. Claire paused to collect herself, gripping the edge of a tray for balance. She took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands. It wasn't just anger she felt, it was something deeper, something that had been building inside her for years. As the last of the guests departed, Charles Donovan reappeared in the ballroom, his tie now loosened and his jacket slung over one shoulder. He moved with the weary grace of a man accustomed to long nights of diplomacy. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on Claire for a moment before he approached her. "You're still here," he said, his tone neutral but carrying a hint of concern. Claire straightened, setting the tray down on the nearest table. "I still have a few tasks to finish, sir." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've had a long night." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I've had worse," she said finally, her voice even. He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "I imagine you have." There was a pause, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Then, to her surprise, he spoke again. "You handled yourself well tonight," Charles said, his tone low. "Not many people would have." Claire frowned slightly, unsure if his words were meant as a compliment or a dismissal. "Thank you, sir." "Victoria can be difficult," he continued, his voice tinged with a quiet frustration. "I hope you don't take her words to heart." Claire's chest tightened. The words were meant to console, but they only highlighted the disparity between their worlds. To Charles, this might have been a fleeting moment, easily dismissed. But for Claire, it was a reminder of how often she had to fight to be seen as more than just a shadow. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" she asked, hoping to end the conversation before her emotions got the better of her. Charles hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he shook his head. "No, that'll be all." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing alone in the emptying ballroom. In the distance, Claire could hear raised voices coming from the east wing of the mansion. She recognized them immediately, Charles and Victoria. Their argument was muffled, but certain words cut through the walls with clarity. "You humiliated yourself tonight, Victoria. Not her. Do you even realize that? She doesn't belong here, Charles. I won't apologize for pointing out the obvious. You went too far. This obsession of yours, it's not healthy. You think I don't see the way you look at her?" Claire felt her stomach drop. She didn't mean to overhear, but the intensity of their words rooted her in place. She turned away, forcing herself to focus on her work. Whatever was happening between the Donovans wasn't her concern. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow become entangled in something far larger than herself. By the time the staff was finally dismissed, the mansion was quiet, the lights dimmed, the guests gone. Claire stepped out into the cool night air, the crisp breeze a welcome relief after the stifling tension inside. She made her way to the staff parking area, her footsteps slow, her thoughts heavy. The night had been a disaster in every sense, and she couldn't wait to put it behind her. But as she reached her car, she noticed something unusual. A sleek black car idled a few spaces away, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver's side door opened, and to her surprise, Charles Donovan stepped out. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. Claire froze, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. "Sir, I wanted to speak with you before you left," he said, stepping closer. She straightened, her weariness replaced by wariness. "Is there a problem?" Charles shook his head. "No. Quite the opposite, actually." There was a pause as he seemed to search for the right words. "You're more than what you appear to be," he said finally. "I saw it tonight, in the way you carried yourself. You don't belong in the background." Claire frowned, unsure what to make of his words. "With respect, sir, I'm just trying to do my job." At yet another article detailing Claire Harper's newfound success. The headline read, "From Humiliation to Triumph, How One Woman's Grace Won Over the World." Victoria's hand clenched around her phone, her nails digging into her palm. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. The world she had so carefully curated was slipping through her fingers, and there was no one left to blame but herself. Months later, Claire stood in front of a packed auditorium at her new law school. She had been invited to speak at an event, her story now a source of inspiration for countless others. "I didn't set out to change anything that night," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I only wanted to do my job." But when someone tells you that you don't belong, that you're less than you know you are, you have a choice. You can let their words define you, or you can rise above them. The audience erupted into applause, and Claire's chest swelled with pride. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not as a cleaner, not as a shadow, but as the woman she had always been. Thank you so much for watching this story. We hope you enjoyed following Claire's journey of resilience and triumph over adversity. If you found this story inspiring or meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue creating more amazing content for you. Every like and subscription makes a huge difference, and we're so grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next video.